So we're up to workshop 9, which means we're almost done. We've only got a couple more weeks to go. And in this week and next week, we're doing a focus on therapeutic jurisprudence. And then last one, we're looking at community policing. So we're looking at all those different um, what are different what's all those different alternative specialist courts, primarily like drug courts, drink driving courts, domestic violence courts, indigenous courts, all those sorts of approaches. Um, and rather than having that generic one size fits all approach to justice, you have a specific mechanism that's designed for a specific type of offence, and it's embedded within all the other services that are needed. So it's very efficient in many ways, but in terms of like our broad picture of justice being equal and operating the same to everyone in all situations, it means we've got that broad idea of rule of law. We do have to step back from that a little bit and have to say that not all criminal justice cases are the same. Um, and there is some risk in that. There is some risk in that in creating specialist courts, um, you're going to treat people differently than if they had appeared in a normal court. But we already do that. I mean, we already in a lot of areas have different areas of regulation that don't go through criminal courts in any case. So it's not like it's the end of the world. But there are people, I guess, from both sides of the fence who think that something like a drug court might be way too lenient. And then there are also the people who are worried that a drug court might be far more oppressive because it's happening in a sort of a treatment metaphor that doesn't have the same sort of protection of civil rights that um, that a court process might have. So it's the same stuff we hit anywhere on those sort of edges of justice innovation, that we know the conventional system doesn't work, but we're also a little bit cautious about alternatives because they might work less than what we already do. If that makes any sense.
Would
Uh,
the civil courts be considered a specialist court?
yeah, well, some wrongdoings only happen through civil litigation. And
Mm.
in some ways, the difference between what's civil and criminal is kind of a historical accident more than anything else. And you look at something like defamation, um, which is mostly civil, but for ages it was a criminal action in Queensland and in other places. So there's some things sit in both, like assault. You can you can have the state prosecute someone for assault, or you can litigate against someone for assault and try and get damages against them. So sometimes they're the same sort of thing, except the civil cases have a lower standard of proof, which is where you get with like the civil assault cases with the Rodney King um, controversy, or where there's a wrongful death, or the sexual assault stuff with Donald Trump. So it's not beyond reasonable doubt. But there's those parallel um, offences in civil law and in criminal law, and sometimes you get things like defamation that have, but for whatever historical reason, end up in one or the other. Um,
But wouldn't the specialist courts that you did mention earlier, wouldn't that like take the strain off the
yes,
criminal justice system? Isn't
yeah,
that was
but
that why it was originally?
yeah, there's lots of reasons for it, and they tend to be broadly successful. Um, um, Robin just mentioned that with civil cases you've got to pay for litigation costs, whereas with criminal the state pays all the costs, which will be a difference. Um, but then again, it's a risk reward thing because apart from the occasional bit of victims compensation laws. You don't get anything as a victim in criminal courts, but civil courts you can sue someone and get damages off them if they have anything worth getting damages from. Um, so yeah,
There's like, if you take someone to criminal court and it doesn't go your way and then take them to civil court, is there like a you can't do that or
no,
like a
it's not. It's not
monetary?
considered You're thinking of double jeopardy, where you can't take.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that happens quite a bit where there's sort of perceived miscarriages of justice. So, like O.J. Simpson, was acquitted by the criminal jury, and then presume it was Nicole's family were successful, I think, in a wrongful death action that was a civil action. And O.J. Simpson was someone who had enough money that it was worth pursuing, unlike many murderers don't have millions of dollars. He was an unusual case. Um, but then they can always say, well, I'm only a wrongful deather, not a murderer.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not there was not enough proof for it to be proven at a criminal trial, but there was enough proof for the balance of probabilities at a civil trial.
Hmm.
Same way Donald Trump is not a criminal rapist, he's only a civil rapist.
Right. Right.
But apparently that's all made up anyway by the state.
Distinction is important.
Yeah, it is important because the level standard of proof is different. Um, but then again, it's not a conviction, a judgment against you in a civil action is still something proven in court at the end of the day, even if it's only balance of probabilities.
Yeah.
Mm. And Robin mentions the doctors with Michael Jackson and Matthew Perry and whatever, um, where there's been inquests and things, and the inquests haven't recommended prosecutions, but families then can bring litigation later on. Um, so anyway, the challenge one is the complex complex issues of offenders. Challenge. So it is the purpose of this first part is just to look at some of the specific problems that offenders might have, how they're currently dealt with in the traditional criminal system, and how a therapeutic model might help. We're going to look at a bit in the second part. We're going to look at in a bit more depth into the drug issues. So the first one, we're going to look at select three common issues offenders who come into criminal justice have. So let's not pick drugs because we're going to talk about drugs in the second half. And let's look at the difference in those systems. So
Three common problems, would that be like being labeled a criminal even though you're not charged, not charged, not, oh wow.
stigmatization.
Yes, thank you.
Robin suggesting homelessness. And a third one. I'll pick one. You both picked one. So the question is, how do we deal with what's the first one? Why are each of these problematic for the current system? So with stigmatization,
Well, if someone is wrongfully accused and then acquitted because it was wrongful, they still have that label. People still think they are the bad person, and then they can't get a job, they can't reintegrate into the community.
and when it comes to them going back into the court system, it as much as we try and make the criminal justice system as impartial as we can. It is part of that system. So if we have, for whatever reason, a particular stigmatization to a particular type of person, or we've got racism, or we've just got like your standard classism of people who are, born in a poor area and talk in a working class accent, all those sort of things. The criminal justice system is part of that overall system, and it reproduces those same biases unless you're very, very careful. Okay, what about homelessness?
Well, see, there's a lot of stigmatization that goes with being homeless as
It
well,
does. It
really.
does.
You're homeless because you don't have enough gumption to pull yourself up, all these sorts of thought processes people have. Whereas these days, you're homeless because there's no houses to rent.
Yeah, yeah. Um, there's also I was remembering Jerry Harvey of Harvey Norman is a particularly strong campaigner against have any sympathy for the homeless. He's he's a lovely man. Um,
Well, see, back in the day, because I'm so old, but it used to be people were homeless because they drank all their money or they had drugs and were kicked out of the house and all these sorts of things. But those are not the reasons people are homeless these days.
no, no, and even then, I mean, the I guess the difference is it used to be very much associated with being damaged in some way.
Hmm.
That you ended up being some kind of addict, but you're probably an addict because of something that had happened to you that had put you in that circumstance. Whereas today, um, the lack of houses, the economic, the cost of living crisis, all those things have meant that increasingly ordinary people and working people have ended up homeless. Bendigo, I think, is having a real crisis with people who can't even afford to live in caravan parks. And there are people who are, camping in the big park in the city square in Bendigo, and the council are trying to get rid of them and move them on. And then they're finding out, oh no, these people have jobs. These are people who are working in the area, and then they're not your old style unemployed homeless that people didn't care about all of a sudden. And it's the same with, I think, soup kitchens are now reporting there's a lot of working poor, a lot more working poor taking advantage of soup kitchens than there were previously. People have jobs, but they just still taking advantage of food support because some they can't afford. Either they haven't got somewhere to rent, or they are renting and they're paying so much rent it's cutting into their income. Um, or possibly even with people with mortgages who have somewhere to live and have a mortgage, but the mortgages are now so out of control they're going down to the food bank and getting support from food banks. So it is bizarre times. It is stuff we haven't seen before, and we're not really prepared for, because a lot of our paradigms we work in around homelessness are about, oh look, we'll get you on your feet and we'll get you a job and we'll stop you being addicted. And these people say, well, I'm not addicted, I've got a job, and I still can't afford things. Um, so I'm just checking Robin's comments there. Um, so yeah, talking about the stigma around homelessness. There's also why it's a problem is lack of resources. Like you're not going to be out there, um, you know, hiring a solicitor. Um, and there's also a whole lot of like a lot of our system works around a person's address as part of their identity. And if you've got to serve documents or whatever, you have to be able to contact them at the address. And someone who is mobile is to put a nice word on it, is hard to contact. And there was a push a few years ago around getting mobile phones to homeless people so they could be contacted, and providing charging stations, which, of someone of my generation for whom mobile phones for many years were just the things that yuppies had, and you laughed at someone with a mobile phone because of how pretentious they were. Um, that it is a strange era when you're thinking about a mobile phone as kind of as a basic human right, and as a kind of a substitute for having a home, is you've got a mobile number that you can be contacted on.
My kids are in the minority. They're at school, but they don't have a mobile phone.
Good
Everyone
for
thinks
them.
it's weird. I'm like, they don't need one. I drop them off at school. I pick them up from school. If they're not with me, I know where they are.
What if a serial killer comes into the school and abducts them?
They're at a private school, so
So the serial killers probably work for the school. So.
but in regards to this lack of address, my friend has a friend who, with the housing crisis, he couldn't stay in, like, he was living in an Airbnb. And then from there, they upped the prices because we had Pink come to town, so he couldn't afford the prices. So he had to get permission from the council to camp on his land. So he has a piece of land, he's just been waiting to build the house.
Hmm.
So he got permission to live on the land. So apparently, the courts had sent him a letter to an old address. He obviously didn't get the letter, didn't turn up for what they wanted because he didn't get the letter. But the police found him on his piece of property. I'm like, if the police can find him, why didn't the letter find him?
Yes, that's because your detectives are so good.
Like, they they came and arrested him from his land
From his
because he
tent.
didn't turn up for court, but he didn't get the letter because they sent it to the wrong address. I'm just like, just make it make sense.
Yes. Well, this is the thing where, um, so much of our culture is built around having that address. And for years, even being a renter was seen as being, prima facie suspicious because you didn't have land that you were tied to. And it's the problem that the travelers in Europe have. Their culture has always been, being on the road and moving around, and that's always been seen as like unreliable because there's no way to tie you down and to contact you and to get in touch with you. Robin's also pointed out that the issue of domestic violence in homelessness, um, and having to be able to get out to places out of violent situations, um, and I mean, rest assured, I believe the government's going to have domestic violence sorted by 2027 or something. There was a press release last week. Federal government's going to sort it out. So we can just lay back and relax. It's obviously not a problem anymore. I've got no idea what they think they're going to do.
Because every perpetrator agrees that they have a problem and are going to go and get it sorted out.
Yeah. That's always been the problem. There's always been the honeymoon period of I'm sorry, I don't know what it made me do it, I'll never do it again kind of stuff. And I think some ways we've become more ignorant of that because we're talking more about coercive control more now, which I think is fine because I think we need to talk about it. But we're also, I think, ignoring the multifaceted nature of offenders and the fact that it is hard to leave someone who is completely and honestly repentant for what they've done and they say they'll never do it again. And
But
they
then you've
believe that.
also got the narcissistic manipulators that go, you make me so mad.
Yeah.
I love you so much, and this is why I do this, or
Mm.
you made me do this. And it's just like, no.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. We've got to do something about domestic violence and it's the rise. I mean, of course, the cost of living crisis is putting pressure on every other part of society. But yeah, I thought it was very bold of Albanese to say, yeah, we're going to have it fixed. We're going to do something serious. We're not going to say what we're going to do, but we're going to fix it. Um,
Well, because I've just handed in my assignment, Townsville Council has a affordable housing scheme or plan. I shouldn't call it a scheme, a plan.
Scheme.
Um, but like the floods were in 2019, and this affordable housing plan was to start in 2025, I think, from memory. I'm like, you're 5 years too late, guys.
Yeah. Yes. And it's only because some pressures come along to do something about it. In terms of let's just fill out the last of the problems: acquired brain injuries, comprehension of process, mens rea, which is for some offences that require intent. It's the mental component. Some offences require you to intentionally do something. When people have acquired brain injuries, how do we know? If it becomes much more difficult to talk about that intent, and we often end up just guessing they must have done it intentionally. And again, we're back in this stigma, poverty, etc. So we've got a few different groups there that have got troubles with the conventional system. What non-therapeutic approaches are taken to those issues? Well, stigmatization, that's just, I suppose the approach is to try and build safeguards in the system to try and stop people being prejudiced. I mean, we're not really effective at it. But concepts like equality before the law um, do tell us that we shouldn't really be prejudiced against people because they're in a stigmatized group. And sometimes there are procedures that are attached to that to remind jurors to, um, you know, for instance, you can't use previous convictions as evidence of guilt in a trial, but it might be someone who the jurors know has previous offences. They might be well known or they're a small community or whatever. So there might be a caution from the judge that says you may know that this person has previous convictions, but you shouldn't let that influence your decision in this case. You have to draw on what you know from the evidence that's presented here. So there are some procedures, but we don't, you know, stigmas persist for a reason, and they persist. Homelessness. What do we do for homelessness? We put people on remand, I guess. Um, we don't do it for therapeutic or other reasons, but if people don't have a fixed address, they don't get bail necessarily, and they stay on remand, which is not great for them. I mean, we have signed a treaty to say that we don't mix remand and convicted prisoners together, but it happens, particularly in small towns. So there's not a lot we do. Robin says, "Well, I've never heard of that before." The treaty, the International Treaty on the Minimum Standards of Treatment for Prisoners, I think it is 70 something. Yeah, and it's just one of them is about children. You shouldn't have young offenders and adult offenders in the same place. There's a whole lot of rules that we agreed to and signed a treaty for yonks ago that we just don't follow. Um, but that's the same for any of these treaties and conventions. We aren't always very good at we sign them, but we don't necessarily follow up on them. Yeah. They say the watch houses are full, we can't do it. Therefore, we had to put the 12-year-old in with the you know, the dangerous, scary men. Um, all right. And the acquired brain injuries again, it's sort of the existing system we might have legal. But legal aid is only available in really um, rare situations. And
What
often
about a representative?
well, there's like the duty solicitor, who will you can go to for advice. But given a lot of these offences sort of go through the magistrates' courts, a lot of people are just self-represented. We don't have a very robust. I'm not saying America does have a robust legal aid system, but we don't have a robust as robust a system as America. And this is again, this is the theme, ties into the theme today. It used to be legal aid was for the people who were really, really poor, and everyone else used solicitors. But what we now know is that the very, very rich and corporations use solicitors. The very, very poor have legal aid. Middle class have nothing. And that's a real crisis in the system, because people.
And if the person you're fighting in court already has legal aid, you don't get legal aid.
Is that true? I don't know.
Yep. So
I,
you got to fight the person. You got to get in first.
okay. I didn't think I don't think basically anyone got legal aid these days anyway. It's been so slashed to pieces. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah,
there's quite a few hoops you got to jump through to get legal aid.
yeah. So often what people do is they go to the duty solicitor, or they turn up to court and they're confused and they don't know what they need to do. And someone from the security staff will say, there's duty solicitors over there with that crowd of 15 people. Wait your turn and see them if you can before your court um, appearance starts. And they will just look at your documents and run through and tell you some things you have to say. So the whole Miranda warning thing, if you do not have an attorney will be appointed for you. Um, not true here. And again in the States, I don't know whether the court-appointed attorneys are necessarily all that useful. Um, so yeah, and again, especially, we've got people in situations where they're very much not used to these sort of processes. Um, the actual help they have in the existing system is pretty much non-existent. All right, that's the non-therapeutic approaches to address the problems. Um, can evaluate those approaches. Well, I think we have in terms of rehabilitation, reintegration, and crime prevention. None of them do terribly much except entrench people's perceptions of the system. But the last question is most important: is what about the therapeutic jurisprudence? So, what might a therapeutic approach do to help with stigmatization?
Um, I don't know if you can therapeutically approach stigmatization because it requires the whole community to have a change of mindset.
Yeah. What you can do is you think about things like Curry Court,
Mm.
where you actually have people who are trained in the issues of the people. Um, I was going to spell personnel wrong. Where you actually have personnel and people involved in the system, and even, um, judicial officers who actually know about the issues, um, and can help people. Um, and they are not necessarily prejudiced themselves. So,
Side
theoretically,
note, how do you become one of them?
become a non-prejudiced person.
No, mental health court trained personnel.
I don't know. Again, I'm not sure. I think Queensland does have um, mental health courts. If I'm not
Not that I'm aware of, but that
okay.
doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, or they did. Queensland was actually really well ahead in the alternative courts for a while, which was quite surprising. But these things go through cycles, and they probably get disbanded because there's community outcry, and you know some teenager peed in someone's fish pond, and all of a sudden we've got to get tough on crime again, and all the rest of it. But yeah, where they exist, they would just be standard court personnel jobs, I would imagine.
Okay.
Um, but they would appoint special people like I'm just thinking of the Neighbourhood Justice Centre in Collingwood in Melbourne. The magistrate they've got there, it's not a problem-solving court by any means, but it does deal with a lot of people from those categories. So the magistrate's someone who's really committed to those equity issues, and all the court staff who get appointed there get interviewed on their views and values, um, down to the people who work in reception, the security people. The security people are fantastic there in terms of like they've got every kind of dissolute and crazy person in Collingwood coming through their doors and being really, really polite and really gentle with everyone that comes through. It's fascinating to watch. But they've obviously been really, really picky with who they pick, even for security there. Um, so so yeah, I don't think they've I've never seen anyone require specific qualifications or anything like that, but it tends to be in the ethos of the organization and who they talk and who they recruit.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just thought it'd be an interesting career choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, unfortunately, unless you live near Collingwood, the neighborhood justice centre isn't an option for most people, but they are trying to export the model to other places, and they have visitors all the time. The Queensland Justice Department have visited quite a lot and have been talking about um, replicating something, I think, in Logan. I
Yeah,
know
it's a
Sean,
bit bad down there at the moment.
yeah, yeah, Logan's a town planning disaster and has been since about 1965. Um, yeah, they they basically sort of created a crime belt through economic exploitation of low-income housing in the north of the Gold Coast and the south of Brisbane, and they kind of converged on each other. It all ties into the Fitzgerald inquiry and the government ministers who were corruptly dealing with property developers. It's 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 a very, very sad story, but it's, people have now inherited it. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that I think we'll talk about that at some point here. I think the Neighbourhood Justice Centre is a great option if you're ever in Melbourne and you've got like a few hours to spare, and you can book in. You probably need to book in time ahead, but they'll give you a tour, um, and are really friendly and are really keen on showing everyone how the place works.
Oh, good.
Um, and it's been, and then I don't know if I've mentioned in this unit or not, it's been hugely successful. The rate of crime in Collingwood has dropped, and they're now finding that many of the people who are uh, uh, arrested for offences in Collingwood are coming from out of the district. But they're actually coming from other parts of the town because there's like a gap, a crime gap in the area. Um, yes. So homelessness again. A lot of it's going to come down to personnel and in terms of procedures.
Would finding out why they're homeless be a therapeutic? So, if it's a case of can't pay rent, or it's a case of in
Yeah.
America, a lot of returning vets end up on the streets because the VA is overrun. Would finding out why they're on and then dealing with that be a therapeutic?
Yes. And that's where the focus of the institution is not purely on conviction or acquittal. It's on the holistic needs. So a lot of your conventional justice system would probably want some, if someone got acquitted or the case got dropped, they'd be like, well, fine, out you go. You know, we don't have to see you anymore because the case isn't going ahead. Whereas a therapeutic approach would say, okay, this person's come into the system. We need to carefully manage the legal processes around them, but that's not the end of the story. That if they're actually gotten into enough of a situation that they're being accused of a crime, whether they're acquitted or convicted, there's obviously a need for further assistance. And part of that would be the figuring out the reasons for homelessness and the possible alternative um, measures that can be taken. Is there a waiting list that can be put on? Is there some other alternative that can be done? And this is what I said before about like from a conventional legal background, sometimes the reach of these specialist courts is much wider than the old-fashioned system. And that can cause concerns for old-fashioned lawyers who can say that, you know, in the old-fashioned courts, the state only had a limited hold on you, whereas in this situation, they can keep controlling and doing things. And yeah, I noticed Stephanie seems to be gone, but and that's the internet on campus too. It's not her personal. Hopefully she'll be back soon. It's almost time for a break. And similar, I mean, the therapeutic jurisprudence for all of them is similar, but for the acquired brain injury, one of the big ones is providing medical assistance. Because you've got situations where people, it's almost always undiagnosed. It's almost always the person who's suffering the brain injury doesn't even know they've got it. Um, and you know, they just keep going back to court again and again and again and getting more convicted more and more times, and no one ever gets to even know there's a traumatic brain injury involved, let alone try and get it treated in some way. So Stephanie's back too.
Yeah, I'm at uni and the internet dropped out, so I don't know what happened
Yeah. A uni tech system failing? Surely not.
there.
So just saying with the others with the acquired brain injury, you can actually focus on the stuff that's not part of the immediate case and can actually look at getting people some medical treatment that they wouldn't ordinarily get. Um, and this is, one of the big ones that we found out about recently and that we have to do something about, because people who we sort of had slurred speech and impaired ability to make decisions, we just said, oh, well, they're a working class person. That's the way working class people talk, because the only people we ever get in contact with are people in court. And we just kind of reinforce that this kind of slurry, slow thinking kind of way it confirms a lot of those class biases. Um, and then now we find out it's like, oh God, they've actually got traumatic brain injuries.
With that, so my son has epilepsy and an intellectual disability. So he does have processing delays and can't answer why questions and stuff like that. So if he was ever to end up in court for whatever reason, he couldn't.
Yeah.
Would there be like, I don't know, would I have to present a letter from the doctor or something? Like,
Traditionally, no. Traditionally, it just doesn't get taken into account. And again, this is why the therapeutic jurisprudence, if only there was a shorter way of saying that, the TJ courts are better because people are actually alert to these issues. They're not just going to go, put the mental stigma, oh, that's a slow person. And therefore, the prejudice is they're more likely to be criminal because of our prejudice against, you know, people who are different and people of different social classes and all those other things. Conventionally, the system just chews up people who can't work within it. Um, And I haven't heard of like specialist courts for acquired brain injuries because the research on it is so new. And it may be that we end up just having to turn the whole court system into a specialist court because the rates are looking like being really high. And you look at the neuropsych research on brain development, and you put that together, and you've got a lot of young guys who don't have a chance because their brains don't stop developing and growing till they're like 26. And by that time, they've already been brought into the system and had their brains injured. They're developing rubbery brains injured by being exposed to the system. So any ideas we have about, criminal intent, criminal responsibility, etc., really need reappraising.
Yes, might have to redefine our definitions.
Yeah. And this is where I know Musser's looking at desistance a lot in his latest research, where the question isn't so much why are these people committing crimes, because we've got lots of reasons, but the question is why are some people who are in the same category not committing crimes? And that may tell us a whole lot more than constantly looking at a lot of people with undeveloped and damaged brains and going, well, you know what? We can see how this happened. Maybe we have to focus more, like Massa's doing, on, well, people who don't, why? Why aren't they doing it?
Yeah. And growing up in traumatic households, people's concept of normal and what's acceptable, they're completely different to what society thinks is normal and acceptable. So,
Yeah,
you know, I ended up in court, but for me that was pretty normal. Like,
yeah, yeah. And then again we get back to the stigmatization, biases, and people's own internal biases, and there's all the stuff we learn in criminology all comes to play here. So I guess the heading up for sort of a little break, one of the things therapeutic jurisprudence encourages us to think about is how do we address some of those things in a systematic way? How do we try and look at things like crime prevention, desistance, trying to make systems that don't re-traumatize or re-stigmatize people? And we know that the current system does that, and we know that attempts to change it are really hard. They're really fraught because everyone says we don't have time. The prisons are full. The watch houses are full. We don't have the resources. Whatever. Our crime rates are lower than they've ever been, really, in most areas. When is
but
there
you got
going to be?
stubborn people ruling at the moment. You got to wait for the millennials to make their way through.
Well, the millennials ruin everything. We know they've ruined marriage, and they've ruined diamonds, and they've ruined flowers, and they've ruined eating out, and
How did we ruin eating out?
because they can't afford to eat out.
Oh, I don't think you can blame millennials for that. That's the economy.
Well, you can't blame millennials for most of the things millennials get blamed for, but they get blamed for everything. Um, but yes, generational change is going to be interesting too. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll get back into part two. Bye. Okay, the second part of what we're looking at today is on mental health, mental illness. I think it's an issue we're all pretty much familiar with. We're also pretty much familiar with critique of policing in the area, not just the justice system, not just like the court system, and also the fact that it's one issue that's located in a broader sort of area of social problems around mental health. So at one extreme, we've got people with mental health issues whose health problems have pushed them to the margins, have pushed them to parts of society where they're stigmatized, they may end up homeless, they may end up with other issues, difficulty securing a job. But we also have to remember that mental health affects, is it something like 30% of people at some point in their life have affected by mental illness? So there's also a lot of everyday people who don't talk about mental health problems. And then there's therefore a lot of problems that are concealed and that are going to be located in ways that are not obvious in the criminal justice system. So something like a condition that causes poor impulse control. If someone fits into the cliche stereotype of someone suffering from mental health problems, it may be far easier to identify than someone who holds down a day job, seems perfectly normal, and hasn't told anyone or doesn't even know themselves that they've got a mental health problem that is causing that kind of behavior. So it's a much bigger issue than just what we immediately see. Um, okay, so we've got the doco of the TED Talk, which I don't know that it says anything we don't said anything that we don't already know, and we've got a series of questions. So why is criminalizing mental health problematic? I think we can start a one before that. Let's ask, what is criminalizing? I think we probably should start there. Um,
Well, I was just discussing with Matisse here because she worked in the jail. There are so many people in, like, there's one person in jail at the moment with noise canceling headphones and a weighted blanket. Like, there's another person in jail who doesn't communicate, can't talk,
mm,
but has behavioral issues. So he's ended up in jail. Like, we need an alternative. Jail is not where these people should be. And I don't know, like, the person that doesn't talk, he's in jail because his behavioral issues meant he repetitively committed a petty crime. So, yes, technically he broke the law and he broke it enough times the judge was like, okay, you're going to jail now. But the thing is, he doesn't talk. He's got a brain injury. He
yeah,
doesn't know what he's, I shouldn't say he doesn't know what he's doing, but he clearly there's something there because he kept repeating the behavior.
yeah. So it's use of imprisonment as a way of managing um, behavioral issues, and these may or may not seem aligned to the mental health condition. So again, you can have like what we would, from a lay perspective, call crazy behavior, running around in public, shouting, ranting, whatever, that's clearly linked to the mental health condition. Or as the one Stephanie just gave us as an example, someone who's got a lack of impulse control.
Are you
That's,
recording? Oh, yeah,
I
sorry.
think so. Yeah. That it then becomes a question of, well, to what extent is the condition predetermining the behavior, and does that change the way in which we treat it? And that's one of those, the whole thing about there's elephants, and under the elephants is elephants, and what's under them? Well, it's elephants all the way down. When we're dealing with something complex like criminal intent, it's impossible to know what's going on in someone else's brain. And the presumption of, the original ideas in our criminal justice system is that we punish people for things they choose to do that are wrong. But what if their ability to choose is impaired? What do we do then? And by default, we just use um, the mechanisms of the criminal justice system to regulate people. And we start out with, your good behavior bonds, your fines, and whatever else. And when those fail, we sort of step up in severity till we hit imprisonment, which is the nothing else works. So we use imprisonment approach. So when we're talking about criminalizing mental health, we're looking at issues that are not that are not your classic intent. They're not someone who goes, "Oh, I feel like being bad today. I'm going to go commit a crime." And I'm not deterred because I don't think the police are going to catch me. So I'm going to commit a crime because I'm a bad person. Um, and again, that's really complicated because, is that person, if we say they're doing it because they're a bad person, is their being a bad person predetermining their choice as well? Is being a bad person making the choice for you, or are you making a free choice? So, this is what sits in the too hard basket of legal philosophy. And occasionally someone will roll out a philosophical talk about what we're doing in terms of people's individual liberty, decision making, so on and so
There
forth.
are also the people that sleep deprived mothers, their brains are rewired.
Yeah.
Sleep deprivation is so bad. Bad is all you're gonna get today. I am sleep deprived. Um, so society just expects mothers to deal. You have a baby, you deal with the sleep deprivation. And then when a mother snaps, because she has not had any support, whether she's gone and asked for it or not, and then she's a murderer, or oh my God, I can't believe she did that. And like that would fall under mental health, I would imagine, but nobody takes into account those sorts of things.
Yeah, there was, oh God. Um, there was a few years ago, and I haven't heard of it much recently. The retired lady shoplifting issue that was put at the it was never spoken of in terms of menopause, but definitely menopause was seen as um something that caused, the respectable lady who did went out on a shoplifting spree. Um, there's a whole lot, and particularly when we're dealing with men trying to understand women's biology, we have a even bigger gap. But there's a whole lot of things that go on um, that have challenged this classical model of the thinking self, to the extent that neurosurgeons, neuroresearchers, people who research brain stuff, um, really can't form an opinion on intent and intention. So what we're left with is kind of these rough ideas of, well, we think if someone does something intentionally, we should punish them. They seem to be more guilty, and we should punish them more severely for it. And if we think that they've done it sort of by planning ahead, that somehow seems worse as well. So none of this stuff is really backed up with the science, and the science is moving us further and further away from those ideas. So it does mean that if you've got someone who's suffering from mental health condition, and we'll go back to shoplifting again. This is a reasonably simple offense. To what extent can we know that someone doesn't have impulse, is just physically, neurophysically doesn't have the impulse control to not do it? Or do they have like 25% control, or 50% control, or 52% control? Um, what we end up with is a lot of just using the criminal justice system as a default when we don't know what else to do. A lot of that also came around with the define mental health too. Exactly, good point. Um, a lot of it came with the end of the institutionalization of a large part of society. I've just read a really good book on autism, which is sitting up there somewhere, on the history of autism and neurotribes by Steve Silberman. Silverman. Anyway, talks about the fact that through a lot of the 20th century, institutionalization of any children that were different was just commonplace. And there's frequent accounts of people who had there's one of the, symptoms of childhood autism is that non-responsive phase where kids go from being reasonably responsive to just not responding to people. What we now know is that's usually a short-term phase, and usually people recover from that. And it's nowhere near as unusual as we'd first thought. But throughout a large portion of the 20th century, up until about the mid 1960s, the solution of doctors was just to institutionalize all those kids. Um, so the book I just read has all these stories of people who were told, look, your kid's autistic. What we recommend is you just put them in the institution and forget about them. Just have some more kids, go on with the rest of your life, and just forget they were ever there. Um,
Yeah, but now we know it's hereditary.
Now we know a whole lot more than we found out from just putting people in institutions and forgetting about them. We learned nothing from that process.
Well, I was just gonna say my older brother has autism and he wasn't diagnosed until he was 11,
Hmm.
and he was just seen as quite naughty and disruptive, and there was a lot of a learning curve. And what's he, 1995 he was born. So there was a lot of like, going to the schools and being like, he's not being naughty and he's not trying to be disruptive. He just doesn't have that mental capacity to be like, you sit there and you raise your hand and you wait until you're called on. He's got the thought, he has to say the thought.
Yeah. Yep. And there are so many different variations, um, particularly, and then there's the ADHD intersection with autism. There was the book. I mean, we've not no real time to go through it now. It's a thick thing. It's like 600 pages, but it was absolutely fascinating as a history of the condition and the way in which we've changed our responses to it. Um,
Well, the process to getting diagnosed is so long.
and
And if
expensive.
and expensive. And if like my son's got ADHD, so the school has to fill out paperwork. I have to fill out paperwork. If those two don't match, they can't diagnose my child.
Yeah,
I'm like, well, he doesn't act this way at school because we mask at school and then we come home and let it all out. Like, which the psychologist knows because we go and see the psychologist, but the psychologist can't diagnose without the paperwork to match. And I'm just like, this is so annoying.
That
yeah,
was similar to my younger brother. He's got autism and ADHD. And when he was little, we knew that there was something else going on there because we'd already been through it 2 times. Because one of my other young brothers has autism, and they just kept telling us it's a quirky personality. And we're like, it's not just a quirky personality. He is bolting every chance he gets. He climbs on everything. He can't regulate his emotions. And yeah, about 5, he was diagnosed with ADHD and autism, and he still struggles with regulating his emotions and he gets frustrated really easily. And you got to try and bring him down from that frustrated level, which can be hard. Sometimes you just have to walk away from him,
yeah,
let him have his moment, and then, okay, we done now, let's have a chat.
yeah. It's so much more about the people around you too, and that learning curve is also about the people understanding the condition. Which again, when we were not mass incarcerating, mass. I suppose we were mass incarcerating, but mass institutionalizing people with those conditions. We never found out enough about them to advance the knowledge at all. And in fact, a lot of the early work in recognition of Asperger's syndrome, which is no longer recognized because it's been folded um, into the spectrum autism idea, um, was just purely so people could get help. There was a big debate that went on about whether people who had what was then called Asperger's were just quirky or whether they actually had a condition. And the advocates who were pushing for it said that, yeah, but at least if we put it in the DSM, people can actually get help and they can actually get assistance. So that was ultimately the decision that led to the at least short-term recognition of Asperger's. Um, but coming into whether it's and yeah, we're also flagging or putting a pin in the fact that Because of the social controls, women are better at masking both of those conditions. That the conditions amongst women is severely under theorized. And women are still being assessed on things like ADHD on the basis of the evidence that's presented for male ADHD. And it presents completely differently if you've been socialized just to sort of mask all those symptoms.
That's the thing. My daughter is a chatterbox. No doubt she also has ADHD because my boys are on the spectrum and apparently so am I. I'm 36 and I find out I'm on the spectrum. Like it was a whole generational thing where it wasn't a thing. You were just a bad kid,
Yeah.
naughty, talked a lot, shy, whatever other label you're going to throw at a kid.
It's interesting.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, my daughter talks constantly when it's bedtime. Apparently ADHD people like nighttime. They're all quiet in the afternoon, and then it's time to get ready for bed, and we are full of energy.
There's
Well, the procrastination.
Oh, look, I do that. I'm good at that. My house sparkles when I have an assignment due.
Everything's
also,
nice and shiny at that point, isn't it?
Yeah.
well, what it does remind me too of is sometimes the problems people have adjusting are more about the social. It's about trying to fit a round peg in a square hole rather than the person being inherently dysfunctional too. It's like if you end up being the kind of person who becomes hyper at night time and has their focus at night, and our society says no, daytime is the time for working and achieving, and nighttime is the time for winding down and sleeping, then you're going to have trouble fitting into that social environment, even though it's not necessarily a problem you have. It's a problem it's a socially organizational problem. But getting back to the criminalization issue, up until sort of the 1960s, any of these things you were either quirky, institutionalized, or bad. Those were kind of the options. And what happened in the 60s was a whole lot of really horrendous scandals involving mental health institutions in the US and throughout the world, I imagine. But the ones that I remember getting, not that I remember, I wasn't alive then, but stuff I read about the having the most publicity with the institutions in the US, and they closed down all those institutions. So society had to very rapidly change from kids have got a problem, we'll institutionalize them so they're not a problem for everyone else, to, well, we're not going to use those institutions anymore because of the terrible things they did in them. Okay, what do we do now?
Now they blame the parents. It's the parents' fault. So, I'm an 80s baby. So growing up, you discipline your children. And now you don't discipline your children. It's child abuse. And now it's everything. Doesn't matter what you do, it's the parents' fault.
Yep. Yep. And I think the high watermark for that was the satanic abuse panic in the 80s. Because people knew something was going wrong with society. And we had a kind of two mythologies converging. And I'm not saying neither of these have no foundation, but one that has less foundation is the, satanic cults thing. There's much less of that around than anyone thinks. And the other one is the sexual abuse impact. And I know there is a high level of victimization of sexual abuse. But the mythology that grew out of that was this idea that you could totally forget sexual abuse and that you'd get multiple personalities, and that anything that went wrong in later life was because you were sexually abused as a kid and must have forgotten about it. And when you had those two things converge, we got the satanic panic with this idea that there were satanic cults operating throughout America, particularly operating throughout daycare centers. And that kids were being abused in all these terrible ways, and then were forgetting any of it had happened, and then you'd get aberrant behavior in later life because they'd forgotten all these things, and then you'd have hypnosis and recovered memories, which would then implant these memories of abuse and so on. But ultimately,
Brain like locks those out, doesn't it? Like for traumatic events and stuff, it blocks it.
I don't think it does very much. I don't think there's much evidence for that.
It's a trauma response.
I think I th like this is definitely out of my area of comfort, except for in terms of debunking the stuff that happened. Like I'm not in my area of expertise. But I think people can not acknowledge abusive things have happened, or they can mask them as different forms of memory to some extent. But I think there's very little evidence that you can be entirely, erase a traumatic memory. It might be something you don't think about, and you do a lot of techniques to not think about that memory. But this idea that an otherwise ordinary person could be walking down the street and suddenly something had happened and they remember that they'd been abused. I don't think there's much basis for that, and it's the same for the multiple personality syndrome, which it was called at the time. This idea that you could actually have completely different personalities. Where that seems to have happened, it seems to be a construct that therapists created. And we are verging off of the topic, I know, as usual, because I get distracted. But I'm getting back to what Stephanie said about ultimately this stuff came back to blaming the parents. That if the parents weren't implicated in abuse, they were obviously neglectful because they sent kids off to daycare centers that were all run by Satanists, which in that era, in the 80s, was about the economic situation where a lot of women were forced to go back to work because of the economic problems. They weren't being, stay-at-home mums, and they were using daycare a lot more. So this created this mass anxiety of fear around daycare centers, and this idea that they were all run by the League of Satan and were killing giraffes and things. You think people will notice a giraffe going missing?
So daycare was basically a cult.
Mm. There were some high-profile trials that just went on and on and on with no evidence of people in daycare centers where children had talked to therapists, had these wild stories of like babies being sacrificed and all kinds of things happening. And there was this always believe the children idea that children don't lie and children don't make things up. Whereas,
Part of the ADHD diagnosis, my son is a great storyteller. Zero truth to any of it, but it's a great story.
Oh, some of the stories my autistic brother has come up with, I'm like, how? Where did that even come from in your brain? Like, how do you?
Yeah, well, you could say the same about Stephen King, couldn't you, really? So anyway, the Satanic Panic was a product of I think that collapse of institutionalization, collapse of, fears about the collapse of the institution of the family. And again, it's like, well, if we haven't got anyone else to blame, we'll have to blame the parents. One of the dominant American explanations for autism for many decades was refrigerator mothers.
I never even heard of a refrigerator mother. What is that?
Well, that is good because it means that it's no longer as widespread as it was for, as I said, decades. And that was that bad mothers created autistic children because they were cold and uncaring.
Oh,
Well, you've got vaccines create them apparently, which was obviously
yes.
debunked. But yeah, vaccines, you vaccinate your child, they get autism.
Yeah. And I mean, we still don't know much about how it manifests. We now seem to think that it's so commonplace, it's possibly not even a disorder. And this is, I guess, why neurodiversity has become such a important concept, that there's a lot of people who are very functional with autism. You get people like Greta Thunberg who say that autism is her superpower because she couldn't do what she did without it. That approach does have the danger, I think, of minimizing the problems for people who the condition creates real problems for. Like there is that extreme at the end where people just self-harm and they really are not having a good time of it.
I can tell you what my psychiatrist said, because only a psychiatrist can diagnose you, psychologists can't.
Yeah.
So I'm 36. I have ASD. I have ASD because my epilepsy was born, right?
Mhm.
So my lack of sleep has caused my brain to be rewired to give me ASD. But it doesn't affect my day-to-day life enough for her to give me the actual diagnosis. I have the information. Yes, you have ASD, but I'm not giving you the piece of paper that gives you the diagnosis because it's not bad enough to affect your day-to-day life.
Wow.
Okay. And then everyone I tell I have ASD, they're like, yeah, well, we knew that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody told me.
That's a common story for a lot of people. And I think to an extent, it's like there's um that, and as I said about that neurodiversity thing, it's recognizing that it's part of the normal experience for a lot of people. And I think, not that I'm justifying your psychiatrist at all, but where it gets tricky is the where people are then considered disabled.
Well, see, that's it too. I think the definition of disabled has changed over the years.
Yeah. So at what point, and what point does any condition, like, if you lose a leg, a shark eats your leg or something like that, at what to what extent does that make you a disabled or able-bodied person in terms of, well, what is it that you do?
I think it becomes
Um,
a mindset.
yeah. And it's a difference between, at what point do people require assistance, and to what point do we think people should get assistance with
See,
conditions?
my son has an intellectual disability. That's what it's called, ID. I call him special needs because that's easier. Everybody knows what special needs is,
Yeah.
but he's not dumb. Like, he just is not mentally at the age where he should be. So we just learn new ways to teach him what he needs to know. Like, it's not debilitating. And I think honestly, it is a mindset. If you're told enough times that you're disabled, you're going to develop that mindset.
Yes. And that's also, I mean, can you imagine in the years when people were just institutionalized straight away for these things? Like once you're inside an institution, the labeling is so complete, is so absolute.
Well, just going off of what Steph said, my older brother has autism and his IQ is actually above average. He's very, very intelligent. But he was looked down on because he's got autism. But he's actually very, very smart.
Asperger called his kids the little professors. Um, and when he was reacting against this sort of developmental disabled kind of label that wasn't using those words, but of the time, um, of children. And he was saying, no, these kids that I'm seeing, they're my little professors. They know so much about very specific things. And they're so smart and they're so clever, but they have sort of social problems. Um,
Because they're not on the same level as everybody else.
yeah.
My 10-year-old is a born negotiator. He's going into politics, this kid, I tell you what.
And I think and the idea of the neurodiversity spectrum is a reasonably recent idea. Um, and it's this idea of there being, because the whole idea used to be of a scale, like at a scale of 1, it didn't affect you very much, and at a scale of 10, you were so disabled you couldn't function without help. And they're moving toward this idea of a spectrum of it all being different and it all affecting people in different ways, which I think is a reasonable way of going. But at the end of the day, we've in really sort of only 50 years, we've gone from a culture where in, took people not even just out of the community, but we took them out of people's lives. People were told, just forget about that kid, just forget you ever had them, and institutionalizing them to back into a condition where it's like, oh, well, now we don't do that anymore because that was cruel, but you're on your own. Your parents, you're pretty much on your own in terms of managing this. And if you've got medical care, I mean, I suppose at least in Australia, we've got reasonably affordable health, but somewhere like the United States, it's a little wonder they want to blame things like vaccines because you can't afford any of the care you need to help out with these kids. So, as usual, where there's a social gap, you've got the criminal justice system coming up and mopping up the problems once they've gotten too far out of control. So, I mean, getting back to our topic about mental health courts and everything else, um, they are tricky. They do go on to that continuum rather than spectrum model because usually you have to be assessed and you have to be assessed under certain tools, frameworks, and conditions that you are not either not. If you don't have a mental health courts, it's like whether or not you have the mental um, prerequisites to stand trial. Um, but even when you do have mental health courts, you have to meet a certain threshold, a certain questionnaire or assessment to be sent to those mental health courts. So that's kind of tricky because there's always going to be someone on either side of the cutoff. There's always going to be people who could go either way, that there has to be a decision that's made. Maybe most people are going to be on that cutoff, but at least it means that the treatment regime is part of the solution of the mental health court. And of course, the other one of the first things you do in my day when you did criminal law was the whole insanity defense thing in murder. And the one thing you get told is never ever try to get your client to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, because the solution then is the person gets committed at Her Majesty's pleasure, which is a really horrible expression, but it basically means you get indefinite detention within the mental health system. So this idea people have that, oh, lawyers argue insanity all the time and people get off, at least in our system, if you get off a murder charge or whatever for a reason of insanity, you end up in a mental institution. And at least a prison you might get out of one day. Mental health institution, your chances of getting out are really low. So yes, having an idea of there being an in-between of these things, and having, for people who are, especially when they're really early on in their criminal careers, having therapeutic options is at least a patch. Possibly we would be better off getting parents the help they need well ahead of any of these things happening, and getting parents support and stopping blaming parents for these things and everything else. Did you see
With that, it would have to be the government to help as well, because, as soon as kids turn 6, parents are expected to go back to work. Now it's changed to 8, well, 14, but between 6 and 14, parents work 15 hours a week. So that was the negotiation, the compromise. And like, I have 2 diagnosed special needs children, and I'm still expected to go to work and be available for my children and take them to their therapy appointments. And, I'm studying as well, trying to better my life. And yes, I'm doing all of this. And the government still expects me to meet their minimum requirement for X, Y, and Z. Like,
yes, there's a huge amount of cultural change, and I think we're going through it. Like, I think culture change is always hard to see when you're in the middle of it. And there's always sort of dog legs where you think things are getting worse than what they are. But I think there does need to be that much. It needs to be, and there seems to be, a broader culture change around child rearing, support, disability. And often it's like people resist the disabled label, and I understand why, but often the disabled label is the way in which you get help. So that's
Which is what
tricky.
I tell everybody. I need that piece of paper so then the school can go to whoever they need to go to with that piece of paper
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
get the funding they need to help my child.
That's where the neurodiverse thing kind of falls down as the only strategy. I'm not saying it's a bad strategy, but oh, what was her name? I really thought that Neurotribes book, if you ever get the time to read a long book, it's really worth it. But there was a British nurse who was very influential, and again, there was the time when they were recognizing Asperger's, and people were saying, yeah, but it's just stigmatizing people with mental illness. It's telling people they're disabled when they aren't. And she was so pragmatic. She said, at least they get help. That's the important thing for now. In the future, yes, we need to make sure that we move to a more enlightened view of what this is. But right now, there are people who need help who are not getting it. And therefore, if we recognize it, and yeah, that was how the battle over the DSM was resolved in, I think, 81, 82. And obviously, we're changing going on from there. Although what most people hear is that the Asperger's was recognized and it's no longer recognized, which is not the whole truth. Um, it's not recognized as a separate thing anymore, and that's because we've expanded the way ASD is defined. But yeah, it is an ongoing and tricky set of problems, and at the far end of this thing, we've got the problem with the criminal justice system being used as the mop when everything else fails.
I feel like because the criminal justice system is behind the times, because it takes so long for things to be changed in the criminal justice system.
Mm.
It lost my thought halfway through. Welcome to AFD.
That's just normal. We all
That's
have
just
that.
normal. Cool. Awesome. That's just being old. I like that one.
Or I have it too.
Because I did intro to law. So I'm just like, it is so hard to get anything changed. And then changing something in the government, you got to go through this and go through that and go through this. And oh no, we don't like that. So come back here and rewrite it and go through it again. By the time that gets passed, well, it's not relevant anymore. We need to do this. And I'm just like, there has to be an easier way. We need to change the way things are changed.
Yeah. I think that's why therapeutic jurisprudence has worked in the way it has, is because it's been able to make fairly abrupt changes kind of in an administrative rather than a legal way. That, like, obviously there needs to be legal support for it, but setting up all these problem-solving courts is something that is easier than changing the normal criminal justice system. And where you've got a present a real present need, particularly like Indigenous courts, mental health courts, drug courts, and things like that, you can make a lot of really abrupt changes. And they seem to also fly under the radar a bit. Like someone wants to open a safe injecting room somewhere, and suddenly everyone has an opinion on it.
I still remember that from the news.
Yeah, it keeps happening from time to time, and it becomes another controversy or whatever. Um, and yet, drug courts seem to be set up all the time, and no one seems to notice them happening. Um, so yeah, I guess it's finding those systemic places where it's possible to make these big changes and big deviations. And then hopefully what you do is you use the successes of those programs to then gradually change the things that are more resistant to change.
This comes back to our schools of strategy.
It does. Everything comes back to strategy. And yeah, this is why I'm a big fan of the Neighborhood Justice Centre, because they are very strategic. And they've been, and then there's a lot of resistance amongst the magistrates in Victoria. The magistrates really hate I'm not to say they all do, but there's a lot of magistrates who are really resistant to that model.
Is it the older magistrates?
At least old in the head. at least people who are, I think it's a lot of people who are also, to be fair to them, really worn out because magistrates' courts are such a sausage factory. And they're just seeing, like, they're just turning people over 10 minutes at a time going through. And I think for a lot of people who've been doing it for a while, the idea that, yeah, we could do something exciting and new, they're like, I'm so tired. I just can't even think about something new. So I think that's part of it.
That's why we have the registrar. They can do it all.
Right. And definitely, like, the NJC would not have worked without everyone at every level being, committed to it.
Our alliance is working.
Yeah. And when one of the big things they did was have big open plan office with everyone from all the different branches sitting in pods next to each other. Made a huge amount of difference. If you want to talk to the drugs person, they're over there. The prisons person, they're over there. The police person, they're over there. We have always having coffee breaks with each other.
That's good because I find that's an issue just trying to get an appointment. I got to talk to this person and this person and then this person. You're all in the same building.
Yes, yeah, and that one of the areas where they found this was a massive issue was drugs. To actually get the drugs counseling people, the community corrections people, all those people just talking to each other. It wasn't even like they disliked each other or were opposed to what anyone else was doing. It was just they weren't talking to each other. So yeah, I, like everyone else, go through phases of doom scrolling the news and thinking, oh, this is never going to get any better. Everything's so terrible. But things are gradually getting better.
I think with education, not, schooling education, but the wider community being educated on what's what and who's who, we can all slowly begin to change our mindsets.
Yeah, and social media kind of disrupted it, threw everything up in the air and opened up a whole lot of misinformation and QAnoners and all sorts of crazy things to come to the fore. But I think we've gradually worked, and some people are still in the thrall of things they read on Facebook, but I think we're gradually moving to accept, to be more critical. And AI is probably helping.
Yeah. Primary schools and high schools now are teaching, um, changing their curriculums to be more technology based and internet aware and all those sorts of things
Yeah,
that I wasn't taught at school.
no. No, and I don't know that I really got any critical literacy on anything. Like if it was in a book, it was true. So, you know, there's probably plenty of things that we probably should be challenging that were in books that we never did. So, yeah, it's probably overall a good thing.
I think we still find that with our journal articles. We assume because it's gone through the peer review process that it's legit, but it's not necessarily
Yeah,
correct information.
yeah. And a really well written, a well positioned piece will acknowledge that and they will say, this is what we know, and this is what we found out, and this is what we think. But yeah, there are a lot, there's still those stuff that comes up all the time with, we've proven that playing Mozart to your baby makes it smarter on the basis of 3 different people that we looked at.
Well, 3 people that said it worked, not
Yeah,
necessarily any empirical data there.
yeah. Um, so, but yeah, I think like there's the whole citation needed meme that people post on Reddit and things. And that's quite a sophisticated thing for people to be thinking about reading stuff and thinking about citations. But the fact it's become a meme, when someone says something outrageous and people post, citation needed. Um, I heard the other day that this is the case, and someone just puts the citation needed meme against it. That's quite sophisticated, in terms of critical thinking. So I'm obviously feeling very, very optimistic today. All that therapeutic jurisprudence has gone to my head.
I am still blown away that high school kids are doing university subjects. It's an option,
Hmm.
but also their high school essays are referenced in Harvard or APA. When I went to high school, I don't think I did any referencing.
No, I didn't. That was a lot longer ago, though. Yeah.
I didn't either, and I finished high school in 2014.
Okay.
Cool. I'm 10 years behind in front of you. Whatever. I just had my 20-year high school reunion. But high school kids that I work with now, they're doing psychology uni subjects in high school
Yeah.
and referencing their high school essays in Harvard or APA. And I'm like, I don't think I did that at school.
No. No, I know I didn't. So, oh well, hopefully we can take this positive, warm feeling we've got with us for at least a few minutes afterwards. Before we look at our phones and go, oh, they've done what to who? I don't
Oh, and
believe
I'm off to parent-teacher interviews after this.
it. Well, have fun with it. Is there anything anyone wanted to bring up before we closed off for the afternoon?
No.
Otherwise, only got a couple more weeks to go. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you all next time.